Hello, poets. It was my choice that we would do this in class. Unfortunately, God had another idea for all of us, and that includes the snow that is now piling up throughout Boston and the environment. I've already been out a couple of times shoveling. It looks like I got another 6 or 8 inches more to go out and shovel after I get done with this video. However, God's blessings are inscrutable. Now, let's talk about semantic relationships and the analysis that's been provided by Robert Alter in The Art of Biblical Poetry. As you know, I did a video on this book earlier introducing the first 3 chapters. It is chapter 2 that I'm going to turn my attention to now. I already had some very helpful questions from Ben in the class about how do we do this? Well, that's what we're about to find out. How do you do semantic relationship analysis? Well, if you turn to page 30 in Art of Biblical Poetry, you'll see that Alter has provided a template for 2 Samuel 22. And he divides each one of these relationships up into one of 4 categories. Category 1, listed by the equal sign, synonymity, synonyms. When one verset has another verset, and they're basically synonymous, or the addition of a single word, but doesn't change the implications of what the first verset would say. He gives the example, God my rock, where I shelter, my shield, my saving horn. The first verset, God my rock, where I shelter, is given a synonym in my shield, my saving horn. Another example of this is on the very next page, page 32, saving tower to his king, and the synonym, performing kindness to his anointed. King and anointed are clearly in parallel. Saving tower and performing kindness are basically synonyms of one another. So he has shown those examples of a synonym. The next example is complementarity, which is shown by the open brackets. An example of that is at line number 9 on page 30. The earth heaved and shuddered, and the complement, heaven's foundations shook. Now there is something almost synonymous, but it becomes a complement between the earth heaved and shuddered and the specification that heaven's foundations shook. And so that's why he calls that a complement. There's something a little bit more than a synonym. There's something added to it. Another example of one of these is in line 32. With you I rush a barrier, and the complement, with my God I vault a wall. Now, they're not synonymous because a barrier and a wall are not the same thing. There's a little bit more said in the second verset of line 32. With you I rush a barrier, and the complement, with my God I vault a wall. To rush and to vault are kind of related, but there's an additional bit of information. That's why he doesn't call line 32 a synonym, he calls it a complement. Now let's talk about the third category Alter uses. That's focusing. Now, under focusing, there's really 4 options that are all shown by this angle bracket more than, the more than sign. Focusing, heightening, intensification, and specification. Let me give you a couple of examples of this from Alter's example on page number 30. On line 8, from his abode he heard my voice, and the focusing, my cry in his ears. Now you see the little angle bracket, the right angle or the more than sign, in the second verset. In, again, line 8, he heard my voice, that's the first statement, and my cry in his ears. It further specifies. Now it's under focusing, but I think in fact that's specification. Let's try another one of these just for point of inference. Let's do line 24 on page 31. For I kept the ways of the Lord. And then the focusing, I did no evil before my God. Now let's discuss why it's not a synonym. I kept the ways of the Lord, I did no evil. A synonym would have to be in the same general statement. I kept the ways of the Lord, I performed his tasks. But here we have the inflection of I kept to I did no evil. That would be a focus or a specification of how the second verset reflects on the first verset. All right, so you get the general idea that focus, heightening, intensification, or specification are all stated by this angle bracket, the greater than sign. Now the last one, consequentiality, or a consequence. This is a little bit more difficult, but it follows. From the first verset, we get the consequence of the second verset. Look at line 4 on page 30. Praised, I called the Lord. That's the first verset. And with a consequence that from my enemies I was saved. Now, they're not synonymous. They're not complementary. It's not really a focusing. It's the consequence in verse 2 of what happens in verse 1. Let's try a different one. On page 31. I pursued my enemies, destroyed them. That's line 40. And the consequence, turned not back till I finished them off. All right, now let's take a look at it. I pursued my enemies and destroyed them. That's the first verse at line 40. Turned not back. Again, we've turned the positive into a negative, so it can't be synonymous and it's not a complement. It's not really focusing. I pursued my enemies. I turned not back. I destroyed them till I finished them off. That last part of the phrase of line 40 is the consequence of the first verset in line 40. Okay, now here's what you're responsible for doing. You're going to take the 5 pages of versets as I have shown them here, and you're going to list in the gaps whether this is synonym, complement, focusing, or consequence. Now, I'll give you a couple of headers. I'm going to introduce probably the first 4 or 5 of these versets with what I think they are. Now, be sure to pay attention to the analysis that Alter does on pages 32 through 36. What he does with 2 Samuel 22 is he suggests that these relationships between semantic phrases generally fall into about 68% dynamic and 22% static. Now, he doesn't define those, but what the dynamic things are, those are either focusing or consequence. That's what dynamic means. And static would be either synonymous or complementary. Now, look at the way he analyzes 2 Sam 22. As he goes through this, he shows that most of the static, that would be the synonyms or the complements, tend to be in the beginning and the ending, what he calls framing. It sets the upper and lower, or the left and right boundaries for the psalm, and then the dynamic relationships, which would obviously be focusing or heightening, intensification, specification, and consequence tend to be in the body of the psalm. Now, you're going to do the same thing with Psalm 22. I'll give you some suggestions. If you have a PDF writer or Adobe, you'll be able to do this as a PDF file. If you don't, just handwrite it. Bring that to class on February 23, and we're going to work through this. This is a graded exercise. It's not optional. This should cause you to really dig into Alter's analysis, and then we'll talk about it in class. If you have any questions, send me a note at my email, jcritchlow@gcts.edu, or you can also send me a text, 603-978-8991. Thank you.